He didn't even wait for the dust to settle before turning the wagon around. The horses kicked up another wave of dirt as Judge Charles Whitmore tightened the reins and muttered something about being late for supper. In the back of the creaking cart, Eleanor gripped the armrest of the bench with white knuckles. Her legs lay still, covered by a faded wool blanket that smelled faintly of mothballs and iodine. On the seat beside her, wrapped in brown paper, clinked a bottle of red wine and a jar of honey. That was what she was worth. Not even a goodbye. The driver didn't say her name. Nobody had. Not since the fever stole her movement below the waist 2 winters ago. Not since the judge started pretending she wasn't his daughter. And now here she was, traded under the sun-scorched sky of Montana, in the fall of 1889, the air sharp with dust and silence. When the wagon stopped outside a weather-beaten cabin perched on a rocky slope, the judge stayed seated. "He's expecting you," he said, not looking at her. Then to the driver, "Leave the ramp down." He handed the wine and honey to a man who'd stepped out onto the porch. Gideon Rowe didn't take the offerings with a smile. He just nodded once, eyes half hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, face carved by weather and old war. He glanced at Eleanor without blinking, not like a man seeing a burden, more like someone remembering pain. "Much obliged," the judge muttered, and turned the wagon around before the girl was even fully unloaded. Eleanor said nothing. The ramp clattered against the dry earth. She wheeled herself forward, arms stiff, shoulders squared, like she was rolling into a courtroom. But there was no jury here, no verdict. Only Gideon, standing still, boots dusted in trail dirt, watching her with the quiet that came from having buried more than a few names. Inside the cabin, the air smelled of smoke, pine, and thyme. He opened the door and stepped aside. Not a word, just space. She rolled in, her chair creaking on the warped floorboards. There was no welcome, no "make yourself at home." Only the sound of the door closing behind her, slow and careful. The cabin was small. One window, a stone hearth, a table that leaned left, a shelf with 3 tin plates and a Bible older than either of them. And on the far wall hung crooked a wooden cross, faded but never taken down. That night she heard the hammering. She stayed awake long after dark, lying on a cot too short for comfort, the wheels of her chair locked at her side. From outside, beyond the cracked window, came the sound of metal on wood. Steady, rhythmic, not rushed, not angry, just determined. She pulled the blanket tighter around her and listened. When the first light of morning bled through the trees, she saw it. A ramp, newly built, rough but sturdy, stretching from the porch to the yard. It hadn't been there yesterday, and no one had asked if she wanted it, but there it was. Later, she wheeled herself to the door and looked out. Gideon was splitting kindling, sleeves rolled, back bent low. She watched for a long moment. Then, with a dry voice unused for weeks, she said, "You didn't have to do that." He didn't look up, just spoke between strikes of the axe. "Didn't do it because I had to." She didn't reply. But when she turned back inside, her hand brushed against the frame of the wooden cross on the wall. Not deliberate, just a touch in passing. But her fingers paused there for a beat longer than she meant. And outside, under a sky beginning to burn gold with day, the ramp stood quiet, like something waiting not to be thanked, but to be used. The ramp creaked under her wheels, but it held. Eleanor descended it for the first time just before noon, arms tight from sleeplessness, neck stiff from a pillow that never quite agreed with her. Gideon had vanished somewhere out past the ridge, his axe echoing in the distance like a distant drumbeat. She didn't follow the sound. She rolled to the edge of the porch and stopped, letting the late autumn sun spill over her like warm water. She hadn't felt sunlight like this in weeks, maybe months. A yellow jacket buzzed near the banister, circled her twice, then vanished. Below the steps, a shallow basin of earth lay waiting, unturned, dry. But to her eyes, it wasn't empty. It looked like something waiting to bloom. She didn't know why that thought crossed her mind. She wasn't a planter. She wasn't anything, really, not anymore. Inside, the cabin was silent, except for the ticking of a warped clock and the soft whistle of wind under the eaves. She wheeled herself slowly along the uneven boards, pausing near the hearth. A kettle sat on the coals, warm but not boiling. She leaned forward, strained, and poured a half cup of water into a chipped mug. Her hands trembled slightly, more from memory than weakness. On the far wall, the cross still hung, crooked, dusty, faintly charred at one edge, as if it had survived a fire. She stared at it, not long enough to mean anything, just long enough to know it hadn't moved. Her father never let a cross hang in the house. He said faith was for weak men, that God only listened to those who earned his attention. And Eleanor, small, fever-broken, dragging her foot behind her even before the chair came, had never been worth the effort. She could still hear him, years ago, snapping, "Don't pray unless you're ready to be disappointed." She hadn't prayed since. That afternoon Gideon returned, his coat slung over one shoulder, a bloodline of sap on his forearm. He didn't speak when he saw her awake, just gave her a quiet nod, set down his tools, and began laying out supper: cornbread, cold beans, a single apple split into wedges. They ate in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence here wasn't a punishment. It was permission. Afterward, he lit a lamp with a match pulled from a tin marked St. Paul. Eleanor noticed the label and said nothing. But later, after he'd fallen into a quiet sleep on the cot opposite hers, she reached into the pocket of her satchel, the one they hadn't rifled when they left her at the courthouse. From inside, she pulled a small, palm-sized book wrapped in cloth. It wasn't a Bible, not exactly. Just verses, stitched by hand, passed down by her mother's mother, the kind of scripture women used when they weren't allowed to carry the full weight of a holy book. She hadn't looked at it in over a year. The edges were frayed, ink faded in places. But when she opened it, a line caught her eye as if underlined by memory alone. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." Psalm 147:3. Her fingers brushed the words like skin. She closed the book gently, as if afraid of waking something, then tucked it beneath her pillow and lay back, staring at the ceiling. No prayers, just that verse, echoing quietly where doubt used to live. Outside, the wind shifted east. The ramp didn't creak again that night. But when she rose the next morning, Eleanor found a small wooden stool placed beside the hearth. On it, a bundle of cloth napkins, clean and folded, and a note in Gideon's firm, uneven hand. "If you want to sort the seeds, they're in the crate by the door. No rush." There was no signature, no expectation, just the kind of offer that didn't ask for gratitude, only choice. She picked up the top napkin, unfolded it slowly, and stared at the knot in the weave. It looked like a cross, unintentional but undeniable, and for the first time in a long while, Eleanor didn't look away. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The days that followed moved like dust across the porch, slow, restless, and quiet. Eleanor didn't speak, not because she couldn't, because she didn't trust her voice to carry anything worth hearing. Her world had shrunk to gestures, a nod for yes, a hard blink for no. She kept to the chair during daylight, wheeling from cot to window, from window to door, but never stepping beyond the ramp. Outside, Gideon worked, always working, fencing the pasture, chopping wood, tending to whatever needed fixing. But every evening, just before the last light faded, he sat on the edge of the porch, opened his Bible, and read. Aloud, but barely. The words spilled from his lips like water into stone, slow, steady, impossible to hold, but impossible not to hear. She didn't look at him, not directly, but she listened. The Psalms, the Gospels, a chapter from Job one night that left her awake until dawn, watching the rafters shift in moonlight. One evening, she watched him pause over a verse, his finger tracing a line slowly. He didn't read it aloud. He just closed the book, breathed deep, and looked out at the trees. That breath, not the words, was what stayed with her. She began keeping a small tin cup near the hearth, filled each morning from the pump outside. No one asked her to. She folded blankets, swept the corner where the wind liked to collect dust, rearranged the dried herbs hung above the sink. Little things, actions without applause. And always, her eyes drifted back to the satchel under her bed, the cloth-wrapped book inside, still untouched since that first night. Then, one night, she dreamed of her mother. Not her face, she couldn't remember that anymore, but her hands. They were singing, not playing an instrument, just moving rhythmically, folding linens, stirring soup, brushing hair from a fevered brow. The hymn had no words, but the melody was the sound of comfort before sleep. When Eleanor woke, it was still dark. Gideon hadn't stirred. The fire was down to embers. She reached beneath the bed and pulled out the cloth bundle. Her hands shook as she unwrapped it. The first verse she saw was Isaiah 43:2. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." She didn't cry, not exactly, but something inside her cracked just enough for warmth to get in. The next morning, Gideon didn't ask about the circles under her eyes. He just nodded toward the corner where a crate sat beside the door. "Seeds," he said, "if you want." She looked at him, really looked, for the first time in days, and nodded. By afternoon, she had spread the crate's contents across a towel on the table. Rosemary, sage, tarragon, wild carrot, and something unlabeled in a paper pouch. She separated each by color, scent, feel. Her fingers weren't precise, but they were patient. That mattered more. Gideon passed behind her once, carrying a pail of nails. He paused. "You've got a gardener's eye," he said. She smirked, barely, and replied, voice dry but steady, "More like stubborn fingers." He didn't laugh, but he didn't look away either. Later, as dusk softened the sharp edges of the cabin, she lit a single lamp and turned to the window. Beyond the glass, the earth still looked hard and silent. But inside, something had shifted. Not the world, just her place in it. And that was a beginning. The next morning, Eleanor wheeled to the porch without being asked. She didn't make a sound, didn't wait for help. The ramp groaned under her weight, but it held steady as she descended, her hands firm on the wheels, her breath caught somewhere between effort and defiance. Gideon was in the yard, sleeves rolled, hammer slung through his belt. He didn't speak when he saw her, just gave a quiet nod and tapped the wooden frame he was setting into the ground. It was a garden bed, raised off the earth, boxed in with hand-cut timber, high enough for her to reach without strain. Eleanor stared at it for a long while. "You built this?" she asked, voice rough from disuse. "Didn't figure the weeds would mind," he replied. That afternoon she worked beside him, not in the garden yet, but in the kitchen, sorting through jars, rearranging the pantry shelves, laying out cloth over the table and pulling out the seed bundles from the day before. Her hands were slow, clumsy, and she dropped more than one packet, but she didn't curse or complain. Gideon passed behind her, carrying firewood, not offering to help, not hovering either, just passing, letting her do it. By mid-afternoon, she had picked the ones she'd try first: rosemary, basil, carrots. She wheeled herself to the porch again, the sun warm on her shoulders. The garden bed waited like an open hand. Gideon handed her a trowel. She took it without thanks. The soil was dark, soft, freshly turned. She dug in with care, her fingers brushing dirt that still held the chill of last night's frost. It caught beneath her nails, clung to her wrist. It felt good, grounding, like memory with weight. Her hands trembled, but she didn't stop. She planted in rows, crooked but honest. Rosemary first, then basil, carrots last, their seeds small and stubborn. When she finished, she sat still, hands dirty, lap dusted with flecks of brown. Gideon brought a tin can of water, left it near her, and said nothing. Later that evening, after washing up, Eleanor stood, not physically, but in spirit. She lit the stove herself, stirred the stew, and seasoned it the way her mother used to, with too much salt and just enough thyme. Gideon didn't comment, but he went back for seconds. That night, before sleep, Eleanor opened the window beside her bed. The breeze smelled faintly of pine and soil. She didn't say anything into the dark, but she closed her eyes with her palms folded in her lap. Not in prayer, just in stillness. And for now, that was enough. They noticed her. Not right away, but over time, in whispers carried through wind-blown fences and market stalls. Someone had seen her at the well, watching Gideon fix the trough. Another claimed they'd spotted her sorting roots in the cabin window. A young man said she looked like a ghost someone had forgotten to bury. "She's still there?" a woman asked at the trading post. "Still," someone muttered back, "in that chair." Rumors grew like weeds. They said Gideon had brought her home out of loneliness, maybe guilt. That she was a burden he was too soft to send away. That she wasn't his kin, nor his wife. So what was she, really? A few were kinder. A widow in the church circle left a bundle of wool and buttons at the gate. No note, just practical kindness. But most were suspicious. In a town this small, people didn't like what they didn't expect. And Eleanor? She heard none of it directly, but she felt it. In the delay of the shopkeeper's hand when passing her goods. In the way two women quieted when she wheeled past the post office. Even the preacher's eyes hesitated when he stopped at the fence and asked if Gideon planned to attend Sunday service again. That morning, a woman in a wide hat walked the full 3 miles from town to the cabin. She was polite, too polite. She introduced herself as Mrs. Langston from the church's Women of Concern committee. "I've come," she said sweetly, "to offer counsel." Gideon was chopping kindling. He didn't pause, just nodded toward the porch. Eleanor sat there, arms crossed in her lap, eyes steady. "I understand," Mrs. Langston began, "that your situation is unique. And it's admirable, truly, that Mr. Rowe is giving you shelter. But we all worry this environment might not be best suited for someone with your limitations." Eleanor didn't answer. "We know of a facility outside Helena," the woman continued. "Clean, staffed, with ladies trained to help. A place with structure and dignity." Gideon's axe split wood behind her. Crack, crack, like punctuation. The woman smiled, thin-lipped. "You'd have your own space, your own schedule." Eleanor raised a hand. "Do you speak for God?" she asked. The woman blinked. No, I represent." "Then stop deciding what he would have preferred." She turned her chair and rolled back inside, slow and measured. Gideon didn't look at Mrs. Langston, didn't escort her, just set down the axe and walked back toward the barn. That night they didn't speak of it. They ate stew on the porch, quiet between bites. But after they cleared the bowls, Gideon lingered by the door. "She'll come back," he said. "Let her." "You sure you're strong enough for all this?" he asked, not unkindly. Eleanor leaned her elbows on her knees. "I'm tired of being taken in because someone thinks I'm too fragile to stand alone, and tired of being sent away for the same reason." Gideon gave a slow nod. "She asked if I wanted dignity," Eleanor said. "Funny, I already had it. She just couldn't see it." He looked at her then, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who belonged. The porch creaked beneath their feet, and somewhere out in the dark, a bird called once, then went quiet. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't have to. Sometimes staying was the loudest answer. She didn't tell him she was going. She left just after sunrise, when the frost still clung to the edges of the porch rail, and the mule blinked slowly at the shifting light. She had tied the harness herself, double-checking each buckle the way Gideon had shown her. Not out of rebellion, but resolve. There were days when she had felt like a passenger in her own skin. Not today. The wagon wheels groaned as she eased down the trail, steering slow, her gloved hands steady on the reins. The dust rose behind her, a quiet proof that she was moving, and no one was pushing. It took 2 hours to reach town, longer than usual, but she didn't rush. People stopped and stared as she rolled in. Men leaning on fence posts, women with baskets of soap or bread or scandal. Children pointed, their mothers quickly swatting their hands down. A dog barked once, then sat down, as if unsure how to react. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't need to. The general store door swung open with the usual chime, but everything else inside fell silent. The shopkeeper, a wiry man named Barnes, blinked behind his spectacles. "I need cloth," she said calmly. "Half yard, duck cotton, and 2 spools of thread, brown and bone." He didn't move. "Also soap," she added, "salt, flour, and tobacco, and bullets, if you still sell those." Someone near the barrels coughed, trying to swallow a laugh. "We, don't usually serve unaccompanied women in—" Barnes trailed off, eyes flicking to the chair. "Situations." Eleanor didn't raise her voice. She reached into the side pouch of the wagon behind her, pulled out a small velvet sack, and placed it on the counter. Then, slowly, she laid an object beside it, a revolver, Gideon's. She didn't point it, she didn't touch it again, just left it there, clean, unloaded, gleaming with quiet history. "I'm not unaccompanied," she said. "I just walk different now." The silence that followed wasn't the awkward kind. It was respect, slow in coming, but real. Barnes cleared his throat and moved toward the shelves. "Brown and bone," he muttered, voice steadier than before. "Got it." When she stepped back outside, supplies packed and tied in bundles, a woman standing beside the trough gave her a nod. Just one. But it was the kind people gave soldiers returning from something unnamed. By the time Eleanor turned the wagon back toward the ridge, the wind had changed. She reached the cabin by dusk. Gideon didn't greet her with questions. He stepped down from the porch, took the supplies from her lap without a word, and carried them inside. She wheeled after him, then paused at the table. From the bag of goods she pulled out a folded sheet of parchment. Thick, cream-colored, lined with her own handwriting. On it, a single name. Eleanor Rowe. No middle, no maiden, no trace of Whitmore. Just the one she had chosen. Gideon saw it. He didn't ask. But that night when he poured the coffee, he set down 2 cups instead of 1. And when Eleanor reached for hers, she did it with hands that no longer trembled. The storm rolled in without warning. By mid-afternoon, the clouds had swallowed the hills, the air heavy and restless. The mule paced the paddock. Birds vanished into pine. The wind pushed low through the valley, slow at first, then faster, like something gathering its anger. Gideon was out bracing the east fence line, muttering to himself between hammer strikes. Eleanor watched from the porch, hands gripped tight on her wheels, the sky reflected in the silver of her lap tray. When the first crack of thunder split the ridge, she didn't flinch. But Gideon froze, just for a second, the hammer suspended in mid-air, eyes locked on something only he could see. Then the rain came, hard, immediate, punishing. By the time he limped back to the cabin, his coat was soaked through, his breath ragged, and his left leg dragging slightly. He dropped the hammer by the door, peeled off his outer layers without looking at her, and tossed them in a heap near the stove. Eleanor had already laid out dry cloth on the bench, set a pan on the coals, and lit the fire high enough to dry the damp from the air. He didn't thank her. She didn't expect him to. There were no words between them for a long time. Just the pop of wet logs and the wind clawing at the shutters. She made a pot of stew from what was left, dried beans, turnip, salted meat, and a few carrots from their early harvest. It wasn't pretty, but it filled the room with something warm and steady. They ate in silence. Eleanor couldn't sit cross-legged. Her legs never gave her that gift. But she leaned on one arm, feet stretched close to the hearth. Her toes had color now, still thin, but not lifeless. After the bowls were rinsed and the fire settled to a glow, she finally spoke. "Did you freeze like that in every storm, or just this one?" Gideon didn't answer right away. He was rubbing his palms together, knuckles red from cold and memory. "I lost them in a fire," he said. "Not a battle, not a raid, just a fire." She didn't interrupt. "I froze then too, not like today, worse. Couldn't move, just listened to it happen." The room was so quiet she could hear the water ticking in the kettle. After a long pause, she said, "You didn't freeze tonight." He looked up. She met his eyes, direct, steady. "You came back." That was all, but something passed between them in that space. Something earned, not spoken. Later, when he stood to add another log to the fire, she rolled to the cabinet, pulled out a wool blanket, and tossed it over his shoulders. "You smell like smoke," she said. "I always do," he replied, almost smiling. She didn't laugh, but her lips curled, just a little. That night, before turning in, they read quietly by their own lamplight. 2 corners of the same cabin, 2 different books. But the rhythm of the pages turned in sync. And as the wind eased outside and the rain softened to a hush, Eleanor turned to the window. The garden bed stood firm under its tarp, untouched by flood or frost. She whispered something then, not a prayer, not quite, just a thought with weight. Maybe storms weren't always sent to ruin. Sometimes they came to make things clean again. The days after the storm settled into a gentler rhythm. Morning frost returned to the edge of the windows, and the wind came slower, softer. The air smelled like pine again, and the earth beneath the porch lost its bitterness. Eleanor rose earlier now. She'd sit near the stove with her hands wrapped around a cup, not for warmth, but for grounding. Her fingers no longer trembled at rest. She liked that. She'd begun keeping a small notebook in the top drawer of the kitchen table. Thin paper, thick cover, stitched binding. Gideon had given it to her a week before, saying only, "Found this in Helena, might be worth something." He hadn't asked what she'd use it for, and she hadn't told him. Each morning, after the fire was stoked and the garden checked, she'd open it and begin to write. Sometimes in single words, other times full paragraphs. Most pages were quiet, but none were empty. She started at the beginning, not the fever, not the wheelchair. Before that, the weight of her father's voice in the house, the absence of her mother's laugh after the 3rd winter, the Bible she wasn't allowed to read, the mirror she wasn't allowed to look too long into. She didn't call it trauma. She just called it the way things were. But by page 10, she stopped writing about what happened to her and started writing about what she wanted to happen next. The garden in spring, the scent of rosemary and burnt toast in the same kitchen, a place where no one asked what she could still do, but instead what she wanted to try. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was clarity. One morning, Gideon found the notebook left open on the table. She hadn't meant to leave it, or maybe she had. It was hard to tell. He didn't read every page, just the one she dog-eared. At the top, 3 words, "I was afraid." And underneath, scrawled in smaller, more determined script, "I'm not anymore." He closed it gently, then stepped outside. When Eleanor came in from airing the linens, she saw something waiting beside her writing chair. A small bundle of lavender, fresh, cut from the back ridge. She said nothing. She didn't need to. That afternoon, she wheeled herself down the garden path and sat by the raised bed. The soil had darkened from the storm, but the green shoots still reached skyward. She let her hands rest on her knees, dirt under her nails, the notebook on her lap. No pen, no planning, just the quiet of something well begun. The sun dipped low, casting amber light across the ridge. She looked up at the cabin, smoke curling from the chimney. Gideon's silhouette in the window, still familiar. This wasn't rescue, and it wasn't escape. It was survival, chosen daily. And for the first time in her life, it felt like hers. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. They heard the hooves long before they saw him. A dull, steady rhythm, not rushed, not panicked. The sound of men who knew they had the law, or at least the fear of it, on their side. Eleanor stood at the porch railing. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for the rifle behind the door. She didn't call Gideon from the shed where he was sharpening tools. She waited. The wagon crested the hill, flanked by 2 riders. Sunlight gleamed off polished boots and brass buckles. The man in the center wore no weapon, but he carried something heavier, paper sealed with wax. Judge Charles Whitmore hadn't aged, or perhaps he had, and the rot had settled deeper, beneath the collar, behind the eyes. His coat was fine wool, lapels sharp, clean boots despite the dust. He looked at Eleanor as though he were still standing in a courtroom, and she were the case he meant to dismiss. "I thought you'd crawl back to town on your own," he said, dismounting with a wince. "But it seems my charity bred stubbornness." Eleanor said nothing. He held up the papers. Court-issued writ.
Unlawful occupancy. This land was never yours, Eleanor. It was lent by me, and I'm here to take it back. Behind him, the 2 men on horseback didn't speak. One held a rifle across his lap. The other had the easy grin of someone who liked to follow orders, especially when they involved pain. Still, Eleanor said nothing. Judge Whitmore's voice sharpened. "You have no right to this house. You think nursing a few roots in the ground makes you someone? You've shamed your family, your blood." At that, Gideon stepped into view. He didn't speak either, not yet. He walked calmly to Eleanor's side, wiped his hands on a cloth, and reached into his coat. Then, without ceremony, he handed the judge a folded parchment. Whitmore unfolded it, read, paused, then laughed. Bitter. "A deed? You think some land office in Helena makes this binding? I am your father, girl. Your authority ends where my name begins." Eleanor looked him in the eye. "You left me at a stranger's door," she said, voice quiet. "That's not what fathers do." The air hung heavy between them. This land wasn't his, and she wasn't his daughter anymore. Judge Whitmore stepped forward. His boots hit the porch steps like gavel strikes. "You're still a crippled girl in a borrowed house," he said, voice low and sharp. "And that deed means nothing without standing. I can erase it with one motion." Eleanor didn't back away. She rolled an inch forward. "Then try," she said. "But know this, if you could have erased me, you would have done it the day you gave me away." A flicker behind his eyes. Not fear, but calculation. She'd spoken louder than he expected. He held up the writ like it was a weapon. "This is law." Gideon finally stepped closer. His presence wasn't loud, it was weight. He placed a hand gently on Eleanor's shoulder. Not to protect, not to silence. to stand with. "She has standing now," he said, voice like gravel soaked in resolve. "And you're standing on her land." Whitmore's face cracked. "You mean to claim she owns you?" "She owns herself," Gideon replied. The judge's fists clenched. "You think you're righteous, playing family out here like it changes blood? You've given her nothing but a shack and dirt." Eleanor rolled forward until she was inches from him. "Then why are you so desperate to take it back?" That stopped him.
She reached into her coat, not for a weapon, but a small wooden box. She opened it slowly and took out a folded slip of paper. It wasn't another deed. It was the receipt, the one he'd signed back when he called it charity. A bottle of cheap wine, a jar of honey, and a daughter. She held it up between them. "Here," she said, "take it. It's yours." He stared at it like it might burn him, but she wasn't done. "You sold a girl you were supposed to raise, and the man you gave her to built a ramp before a bedroom." Her voice didn't shake. "I'm not yours to shame anymore, not your burden, not your regret. You don't get to rewrite what happened. I'm not asking for your blessing. I buried that need in the dirt behind this house." For a long time, the only sound was the wind scratching at the porch. Then, slowly, she dropped the receipt to the ground. Didn't tear it, didn't burn it, just let it fall. Irrelevant now. Gideon picked it up and placed it back in the box. The judge turned, silent, defeated, but not done. Judge Whitmore didn't mount his horse right away. He stood there, in the dirt, hands trembling at his sides, mouth curling around a bitterness too long aged. His silence wasn't surrender. It was poison looking for a sharper shape. Then he spoke. "Listen to yourself," he said. "You sound like her." It took Eleanor a second to realize who he meant. Her mother. The one he never spoke of except in past tense, like a sin he never confessed. He stepped closer again, not with authority, with venom. "You think some crusty ex-soldier makes you new? You think a patch of land and pity turns you whole? You're still mine, Eleanor. Broken, forgotten, shame-born. You carry that name whether you speak it or not." Then he spat at the ground just beside her wheel, and that's when he said it. "You're not my daughter." It wasn't a roar, it was a sentence, and he meant it to be final. Eleanor stared at him for a long time, not shocked, not even hurt, just still. Then, slowly, she reached into the pouch at her side and pulled out the only thing she'd taken from her father's house, the nameplate once nailed above her childhood bedroom. The edges were worn, one corner split, the name carved in it, shallow and uneven. Eleanor Whitmore. She turned it over. On the back, in her handwriting, just yesterday, a new name had been carved with the tip of her pocket knife. She looked up at her father, held the nameplate between them. "This side," she said, tapping the fresh carving, "was made with blood I chose, not the one I survived." Then she tossed the old name into the dust and wheeled back to Gideon. For the first time, he reached for her hand. Not to guide, not to pull, just to hold. She gripped his fingers tightly. A quiet moment passed. The judge said nothing more. He climbed onto his horse with the stiffness of a man carrying more than age. He didn't look back. The two riders followed him like shadows too tired to fight the light, and then they were gone. The wind picked up, but it wasn't cold. It was the kind of wind that clears. They didn't speak for a long while after the riders vanished. Not as the sun dropped behind the ridge. not as the cold crept in, brushing along the porch like a ghost asking to be remembered. Gideon sat beside her, not hovering, not pressing, just there. The box with the receipt sat untouched between them. Eleanor watched the last traces of dust settle on the ground where her father had stood. Then, wordless, she turned her chair and rolled toward the shed. Gideon didn't follow. He knew this part was hers. Inside, she found what she needed: a scrap of old pine board, wide and straight, a carving knife, a jar of ochre mixed with leftover ash. It wasn't planned, it was instinct. By lantern light, her hands moved, not fast but sure. The blade scraped the words slowly, each letter biting into the grain like breath finally spoken aloud. When she emerged an hour later, the board lay across her lap. Gideon looked up. He didn't ask what it said. She wheeled past him toward the fence post closest to the cabin. The same one he'd fixed the first night she arrived. The same one she'd passed 100 times without looking. She hammered the sign in with the side of her fist and the weight of something deeper than pain. Then she rolled back. Let him read it. He lit the lantern, held it close. The word was simple, burned into the wood. Grace. Not a sermon, not a scripture, just the one thing neither of them had ever been given freely. And now, it was theirs. She deserves a name, Eleanor said. Her voice didn't waver. This house, this land, this life. If I'm going to be reborn, I'm not doing it unnamed. Gideon nodded once, then bent down and pressed the sign deeper into the dirt with his bare hands. "You're not alone anymore," he said, "and nothing taken from you is lost." Inside, that night, Eleanor gathered the papers her father once thought would control her. His old letters, childhood permissions, even a photo with her name scrawled behind it. She lit the stove. One by one, the papers curled into flame. Not out of hate, but because history didn't own her anymore. When the fire settled into embers, she placed the nameplate, the one with Roe on the back, on the mantel. She didn't need it nailed to a door. It was already carved into her. It started with a wave of nausea, soft at first, then heavier. Eleanor didn't say anything for 2 days. She didn't panic. She didn't Google symptoms. There was no such thing out here, just instinct and the weight of knowing when your body starts whispering new things. On the 3rd morning, as she chopped dried rosemary beside the stove, a sharp pang twisted low in her belly. Then came the blood. Barely a trace, but enough to break silence. She cleaned it with an old scarf, not out of shame, but reverence. Later, she folded the scarf carefully, placed it on the table, and on top of it she laid a single stalk of lavender. Then she waited for Gideon to return from the northern fence. When he stepped in, dust clinging to his boots, coat unbuttoned, she slid the bundle across the table. He looked at it, then at her. He didn't speak at first. Then, softly, like breaking something sacred, he asked, "Are you—" Eleanor nodded once. "I don't know how far along," she said, "but it's real." Gideon sat, slowly, like the air had shifted, thickened. His hands stayed still, but his eyes brimmed with something more than worry. Awe, maybe. Fear. Hope disguised as caution. "Are you okay?" he asked. Eleanor exhaled, not shaky, just deep. "I don't want to be afraid of it," she said. That night, as he mended the crib rail he'd started months ago, a quiet hobby he'd never explained, she wrote a letter to someone who didn't yet breathe, but already lived inside her. "You won't carry my shame. You'll know your mother by name. You'll grow up in a place not of walls, but of roots. And even if the world never lets you run, you will rise.
She folded the paper, pressed it into a small tin box, and buried it beneath the first patch of thawing earth near the garden. No grand declarations, no cries into the sky, just the quiet decision to let life begin on her terms. Later that night, as frost bit gently at the windows and the lantern swayed low, Gideon placed the nearly finished cradle at the foot of her bed. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. And Eleanor? She didn't cry. She only rested her hand on her stomach, not to mourn what she'd lost, but to greet what she now carried. Winter pressed in harder that week, the kind of cold that cracked wood, silenced birds, and made the sky look brittle. Eleanor's joints ached more. She wore 3 layers, sometimes 4. Still, she insisted on moving, wheeling herself through the cabin, out onto the porch, even around the edge of the garden where Frost slept under burlap. The herbs had long since dried. The soil curled at the edges like old parchment, but she still touched each planter, still whispered things only the roots could hear. Gideon didn't ask what. Instead, he chopped more wood than necessary, his arms working like machines, never once complaining of the ache in his bad shoulder. He reinforced the doors again, sharpened every tool. And when Eleanor looked up from her sewing, she'd sometimes catch him just watching, not hovering, not worried, just making sure nothing fell apart. One evening, she finished the last hem on a tiny wool blanket, dark green with a single stitched star in the corner. She folded it, set it inside the cradle, then ran her hand along the edge, slow, careful, reverent. "You think they'll come back?" she asked. He didn't lie. "Yes." She nodded once, then smiled, faint and lopsided. "Then we'll be ready." That night they sat on the floor, backs against the warm brick of the hearth. They didn't speak of vengeance or fear or plans. They spoke of names. Not for the baby, not yet, but for what they were building, a life. Something slow, something deliberate. She told him about a dream she'd had once when she was a girl, of a house full of books and silence, and something soft in the air like peace. He told her about a letter he'd never sent, written during the war, folded so many times the ink had worn off. "I never mailed it," he said, "but I still remember every word." Eleanor leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, snow fell slow but sure. Inside, a kettle sang low on the stove, and the air smelled of sage and ash. The cradle sat in the corner, half-shadowed, already holding more than wood. Hope. Memory. The stubborn kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It simply endures. They didn't toast. They didn't bless. But when the lantern flickered and the cold pressed harder against the walls, they both knew. They wouldn't run. Not now. Not ever again. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The frost broke the second week of March. It didn't announce itself. No birds returned, no flowers sprang up overnight. Just the earth, softening. One morning, Eleanor rolled onto the porch and felt something shift in the air. The wind no longer bit. It hummed. The soil smelled sweeter. When she passed the garden beds, tiny green shoots peeked from beneath the mulch, bold little things with no memory of snow. She rested her palm on her stomach. There it was again, a flutter, a nudge. The baby was moving more now, as if already curious. She smiled. "Don't rush," she whispered. "You've got time. You're safe." That evening, she lit the lamp early, sat by the window, and began telling stories, not from books, but from memory. Not the kind written in pages, but in scars. She told the baby about the first night she arrived, small and silent and unwanted. About the man who built a ramp before she asked. About the morning she dared plant rosemary with trembling hands.
She didn't shy away from pain, she just didn't give it the final word. "You weren't born from pity," she whispered, hand over her belly. "You were born from something that chose to stay when everything else walked away." In the days that followed, she wrote those stories down. Not for publication, not for preaching, just folded pages kept in a cedar box under her bed, her legacy in ink and soil. One morning, she found Gideon in the yard with his tools spread out. He didn't say what he was doing. He didn't have to. He was carving something into the porch beam with deliberate care. She wheeled beside him, squinted at the letters forming beneath his hand. Grace. Below it, smaller, Est, April 14, 1889. Her arrival day. She reached out, tracing the groove with her finger. "You remembered the date?" He didn't look up. "I remember everything that mattered." That night, the wind came gentle through the open window. She lay in bed with the cradle beside her, the blanket neatly folded. The garden whispered under moonlight. The world wasn't healed, not fully, but here, in this little corner, carved out of wilderness and memory, something had been redeemed. Not by vengeance, not by fire, but by staying, by planting, by bearing new life without apology. It was the first time she'd been asked to speak in public. The women of the small town's church had sent an invitation, handwritten, careful, not overly familiar, just a quiet request. "Would you consider sharing a word at our spring prayer gathering?" Eleanor stared at the note for nearly an hour before replying. She didn't ask Gideon what he thought. She simply said, yes. The day came warm. She wore a pale blue dress, the one she'd repaired herself, with a patch of rosemary stitched above the hem. The sun caught her shoulders as Gideon helped her into the wagon, her hand steady on the lap blanket. The town looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. When she entered the small chapel, silence greeted her, not of rejection, but of reverence. Dozens of women sat in folding chairs, their Sunday best softened by the spring air. There were curious eyes, wary ones too, but there were also nods, a few hands pressed to hearts. She wheeled to the front, alone. The pastor's wife stood beside her, smiling, then stepped back. Eleanor looked down for a breath, then up. "I used to think I had no place to speak," she said, "because I couldn't walk, because I couldn't belong." She paused. No one said it outright, of course. They just stepped back, quietly, as if my silence made theirs more comfortable. Some women looked down. Others leaned forward. Eleanor continued. "I was given away once, left at a cabin in the hills with nothing but a bottle of honey and a prayer someone else whispered for me. They called it kindness. I know now it was dismissal." She let that hang. "But something happened when no one watched," she said, voice steady. "I grew roots. Not fast, not loud, but deep. A man who could have ignored me didn't. A plot of earth that should have stayed barren bloomed. And a body they said was done carried life again." She laid her hands on her belly, gently. "And I came here today not because I want applause or pity. I've had enough of both. I came to tell you this." She looked at them, all of them. "Even if you've been cast out, named unwanted, or written off by your own blood, grace can still make a home in you, and you can still choose to stay and rise." Silence followed. Then a hand clapped. Then two. Then all. But Eleanor didn't stay for praise. She returned home before sundown. The cabin welcomed her with lavender at the door. She opened it slowly, letting the light spill through. The garden was alive, not perfect, but stubborn in its blooming. She wheeled to the edge, placed a hand in the soil, and smiled. Because healing, she'd learned, isn't about forgetting. It's about planting new things where the old things broke. Inside, the cradle waited. Outside, the wind carried her name. Not Eleanor Whitmore, not a whisper behind a judge's door. Just Eleanor, mother, tiller of earth, keeper of grace. And perhaps, as you listened, something in you stirred. A memory, maybe, of someone once left behind. Of a mother who stayed quiet too long. Of a cabin not unlike this one, tucked into the hills, forgotten by maps, but never by the hearts that lived there. Eleanor's story isn't just hers. It belongs to every voice that wasn't heard, every soul who found home in the wilderness, every hand that dared plant something in soil once thought barren. This is the true Wild West. Not just gunfights and dust and danger, but quiet resilience, silent grace, lives reclaimed in the stillness. If this story touched a part of your past, if it reminded you of your mother, your grandfather, or even yourself, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more true Wild West stories, not just of cowboys, but of courage, not just of lawmen, but of love. And if someone you know needs to hear this, share it. Because sometimes the greatest frontier is not out there in the wild. It's the heart we carry home.